What made a small concealed British lapel knife a potentially lethal tool for SOE agents during World War II? And why does its story remain shrouded in secrecy? From hidden blades stitched into clothing to training designed for seconds, every detail reveals the extreme measures taken to preserve agency under capture. Stay with us, because the secrets of this final option will leave you speechless. The room has no windows and it does not need them. A single bulb hangs high above the chair, casting a flat, colourless glow that strips all sense of time. The walls are bare, the air stale. Sound is swallowed by plaster and concrete, leaving every movement muted. This is not a place for violence. It is a place for waiting. A man sits bound, wrists behind his back, ankles secured to the chair legs. His jacket, shoes and belt have been removed, each item placed beyond reach. He has been searched once, twice, and a third time, methodically, by men who know every seam, pocket and fold. Watches, buttons, soles, collars, nothing escapes inspection. Every object is examined as if it could conceal deception. By the time the door closes, he understands. Whatever protection he carried is gone. The tools that made him an operative are gone. He's no longer trained for war. He is a detainee. German security services did not rely on chaos or rage to extract information. They relied on certainty. They controlled the environment, the schedule, the body itself. Sleep was interrupted. Food was rationed. Silence was used deliberately. Interrogation was not a single event, but a process that unfolded slowly, eroding resistance through repetition and fatigue. The objective was never punishment. It was accessible. Names, locations, frequencies, schedules. One compromised agent could unravel an entire network if pressed long enough. Every hour a prisoner remained alive and conscious was an opportunity. This reality was understood in London long before it was experienced in Paris or Prague. Planners within Britain's covert organisations knew that capture was not a possibility, but an expectation. Agents were trained to operate under the assumption that eventually someone would be taken. The question was not whether the enemy would search thoroughly, but how long resistance could realistically be maintained once all tools were removed. The answer, in most cases, was not long. Human endurance has limits, particularly when isolation replaces momentum. Courage, when separated from action, becomes something abstract. Weeks inside a guarded building compress the world to a chair, a door, and the sound of footsteps in a corridor. Even the strongest resolve begins to erode when nothing happens except waiting. It was this moment, not the battlefield, that defined the problem, not escape across open country, not sabotage or ambush, but the quiet aftermath of failure, when the machinery of the enemy closes completely around a single person. At that moment, an unarmed prisoner has no leverage. The guards are alert, the doors are locked, the building is designed to prevent surprise, every movement is observed, the environment belongs entirely to the captors. From a conventional military perspective, there is nothing to be done. Capture marks the end of usefulness. From an intelligence perspective, it marks the beginning of danger. British planners understood that hope itself could be a liability if it was not grounded in something tangible. Telling agents to resist indefinitely was unrealistic. Promising rescue was dishonest. What could be offered instead was a final narrow margin of agency. Not an escape plan, not a guarantee, just the possibility of disruption. The room with no windows represents the true endpoint of clandestine warfare. It is where narratives stop and records thin out. Many who entered such rooms never left them. Some survived by enduring, others by cooperating. Few had any meaningful choice once the door closed, not for victory, but for the moment when all other options had been removed and silence pressed in from every side. In that stillness, the smallest detail could matter. A seam overlooked, a weight unnoticed, a final option concealed not for battle, but for the briefest interruption of control. The room was never meant to be escaped easily. It was meant to be endured, and it was precisely there that a different kind of thinking would soon take shape. When equipment fails. By the time an agent was seated in a guarded room, the tools of his trade had already been rendered useless. Pistol, explosives, radios, and hidden caches, the very instruments designed to empower him, were stripped away. These were not accidental losses. They were the predictable outcomes of methodical planning and meticulous procedure. Every operation, every concealment, every gadget that might have offered leverage in the field evaporated under the hands of professionals trained to find it. Britain's Special Operations Executive, charged with sending agents behind enemy lines, had anticipated the problem. Operatives were trained to carry weapons disguised as everyday objects, pistols hidden within canes, explosives camouflaged as coal, radios compact enough to fit into a suitcase. Every detail was calculated to survive the normal scrutiny of checkpoints and casual inspections. But capture inside a fully controlled enemy facility was another matter entirely. The German security apparatus had perfected the art of the search. The SD and SIPO, branches of the Gestapo, examined every item a prisoner carried. Shoes were unfastened, bent, and soles pressed for hidden compartments. Belts were removed, watches scrutinized. Pockets were emptied, seams pinched. Even clothing seemingly harmless was treated with precision. Nothing capable of concealing a tool or weapon escaped attention. In this environment, equipment failed completely. Radios became mute relics. Pistols, once extensions of authority, were reduced to inert metal. Explosives lost all utility once separated from triggers. Ingenious disguises, coal-concealing plastic explosives or pens converted into daggers, were revealed by trained eyes. Security that had protected the agent became an illusion. This was the moment when operational skill met reality. Abilities that allowed an agent to move unseen through occupied Europe were irrelevant within the confines of a secured building. Control belonged entirely to the captors. Escape, sabotage, or defense was impossible. Agents were subject to the architecture of the facility, the schedule of guards, and the relentless method of interrogation. The collapse of equipment under scrutiny forced a different kind of preparation. Planners in London and Hertfordshire understood that capture would inevitably strip agents of their conventional tools. Contingencies were designed not to prevent capture, but to mitigate its consequences. Every item an agent carried had a hidden purpose, but the question was whether anything could remain once routine searches had been completed. It was in this context that the idea of a final option emerged. Conventional weaponry, large and visible, could be discovered and neutralized. The challenge was to provide a method of resistance that could survive the most thorough search. The SOE needed a solution that worked even when every conventional advantage was gone. A device small enough to be overlooked, light enough to remain unnoticed, but sufficient to create a moment of disruption. Enough, at least, to offer the agent a chance. The inadequacy of ordinary tools highlights the essential vulnerability of the agent in captivity. A pistol, however well concealed, is heavy. A radio, however compact, cannot move when the prisoner is restrained. Explosives require preparation, space, and time, none of which exist in a guarded room designed for compliance. Once the agent is seated, cuffed, and observed, these instruments of power are nullified. This failure is more than mechanical, it is psychological. Agents trained to operate in conditions of uncertainty, to improvise and adapt, confront an environment where adaptation is constrained. The body becomes the primary instrument, yet its range is limited. Hands bound, arms restrained, movement restricted. The mind, capable of planning, is forced to operate within a cage defined by steel doors, watchful eyes, and unbroken procedure. Every lesson in the field, the careful threading through checkpoints, the concealment of messages, the silent signals exchanged in crowds, becomes irrelevant. The environment itself dictates the terms. This failure of equipment emphasizes the gap between operational training and the ultimate moment of vulnerability. Yet it also frames the solution that will come later. The need for a weapon that can survive searches, a tool that can be used even when the body's restrained, arises directly from this failure. By understanding what conventional equipment cannot do, the architects of clandestine warfare were able to imagine a new kind of instrument. One so small, so unassuming, that it could exist even in the strictest environment, offering the agent one final narrow chance to influence the outcome. In the cold logic of capture, conventional tools are useless. They can be taken, rendered inert, or neutralized. The agent is reduced to presence alone, the body in a chair, the hands bound, the senses alert. From this failure, however, the necessity of innovation becomes clear. Equipment fails not because it is defective, but because it is inadequate to the realities of captivity. And from inadequacy, necessity is born. Interrogation as a system. By the time an operative reached a German detention facility, the transition from field autonomy to imposed structure was immediate and absolute. The cell doors were not merely barriers of metal and wood. They were instruments of control, precise in their silence and the way they framed time. Each measured step within these walls served a purpose, a function designed not to inflict pain for its own sake, but to extract information efficiently, predictably, and without error. The system relied on consistency rather than brutality, on routine rather than spectacle. From the outside, the process appeared austere and minimalistic. Captors did not need theatrics. The very architecture of the facility enforced obedience. Cells were small, sparsely furnished, and consistently lit in tones that disoriented the senses. Clocks were present, but often reset or removed to disrupt natural perception of day and night. Meals arrived at fixed intervals, carefully portioned, neither indulgent nor depriving. Sleep was fragmented not by noise but by uncertainty, an expectation that someone might enter the room at any moment. The psychological effect was cumulative. The agent, stripped of autonomy, confronted with the predictability of the system itself, became a participant in a machine whose rhythm was entirely external. The interrogators operated under codified procedures that were as much about observation as questioning. Detailed logs recorded demeanor, posture, speech patterns, and hesitation. Notes were filed and cross-referenced against other detainees, sometimes forming patterns long before any statement could be coaxed from a prisoner. Interrogation sessions were measured in hours, sometimes days, but the emphasis was on repetition and variation rather than sudden force. A single unanswered question could be returned to multiple times, phrased differently, accompanied by subtle shifts in lighting or seating, testing both memory and resolve. Each adjustment was calculated, designed to isolate inconsistencies in an operative's narrative to exploit fatigue or distraction, without creating overt marks that could later discredit the system. Isolation played a central role. Human interaction, when it occurred, was not warmth, but observation. Captives were often moved between rooms or subjected to brief, controlled conversation. Interrogators did not speak to comfort or threaten beyond procedural necessity. Every engagement was data, every pause a measurement. The intent was clarity, precision, and control, reducing the operative to an analyzable entity, rather than confronting them with moral choice or emotional horror. It was not cruelty for cruelty's sake, but efficiency at the expense of individual agency. The cumulative effect of this methodical system extended beyond immediate questioning. Agents were left to wrestle with uncertainty, the limits of what the captor knew, the reliability of the information in their own mind, the inevitability of repetition. Small discrepancies in recall, minor inconsistencies in description, became critical points for the interrogators, carefully noted and revisited. Over time, the mental strain eclipsed the need for physical force. Even trained operatives, conditioned for resistance and survival, experienced the slow erosion of confidence. They learned that secrecy was not merely a matter of defiance, but of endurance against a system designed to anticipate human weakness. Files recovered after the war revealed the rigor behind these practices. Reports were precise, almost clinical. The absence of sensational detail spoke volumes. The system was designed to function independently of narrative drama. Each detainee was catalogued, analysed, and observed within a framework that valued order above all else. The interrogator's role was to operate the mechanism of intelligence, to apply technique rather than temperament, to let the system rather than an individual dictate outcomes. In this environment, the mind became the final battlefield. Physical strength, training, and previous experience mattered little compared to endurance, perception, and adaptation. Agents discovered quickly that resistance was measured not in defiance, but in maintaining coherence under relentless observation. Interrogation was a system of quiet persistence, a mechanical process that leveraged the predictability of human nature against the instincts of survival. It was silent, methodical, and inescapable. The true test was not whether one could endure violence, whether one could endure the absence of it, the relentless march of observation, and the certainty that every action was being noted and interpreted. designing a final option. While interrogation systems in occupied Europe stripped operatives of their autonomy, Britain's response did not focus on matching cruelty with cruelty, nor on attempting to replicate the exact pressures faced in German detention centres. Instead, planners in London concentrated on contingency, on the grim acknowledgement that some agents would be captured, and that certain missions might end with confinement rather than extraction. The problem was not simply survival, it was maintaining agency in a circumstance deliberately designed to remove it. From this recognition emerged a philosophy that was cautious, precise, and uncompromising. The creation of a tool intended not for triumph, but for controlled failure. This final option was never discussed in terms of heroism or glory. Engineers, operatives, and intelligence officers framed it in functional language, a means to preserve the dignity of choice when all other avenues had been foreclosed. Its development demanded a balance of mechanics, psychology, and human physiology. The design process considered the operator under maximum stress, alone, observed, and deprived of conventional support. The item could not rely on strength, on skillful sleight of hand, or on ideal conditions. It had to exist quietly, almost invisibly, ready for use in seconds, and adaptable to the unpredictable geometry of a cell, the thickness of a uniform, or the reach of an interrogator's grip. The conceptualization was deliberate and iterative. Early prototypes were tested for size, weight, and concealment, measured against an understanding of human reaction under extreme duress. Materials were chosen not for elegance but for endurance, the resistance to bending or breaking, the ability to withstand moisture and temperature variations, the quietness of metal sliding against fabric. Every adjustment implied intent without stating it aloud. The weapon's very existence suggested a boundary, a limit to which an operative could assert control even when the external world had stripped everything else away. It was not about killing, it was about maintaining the possibility of self-determination within a system designed to erase it. The development process also reflected a broader philosophy of preparation. Designers were aware that the tool could never be guaranteed as a solution. It was a contingency, a last resort measure against an adversary who had anticipated almost every conventional method of resistance. Its presence was as much psychological as practical. Operatives trained with it understood that even in captivity, the mind could preserve autonomy through the knowledge that a final choice remained theirs alone. In training manuals and secret bulletins, language was measured and neutral. The manuals did not glorify action. They provided instruction, often in abstract diagrams detailing angles, motion economy, and concealment strategy. Every sentence reflected the sober reality of a situation in which failure was likely, but preparation was essential. London's engineers approached the design of this final option as they would have a technical problem, not a moral one. They applied principles of ergonomics, mechanical leverage, and materials science, treating the operator as a dynamic variable in a closed system. The operative's physical parameters, hand size, wrist flexibility, reaction speed, were considered alongside environmental factors such as uniforms, room dimensions, and illumination. Nothing was left to chance, yet nothing promised success. This precision was necessary because the tool's very purpose was contingency. It was meant to exist only if all other systems failed, a hidden variable in an environment where uncertainty was absolute. In the quiet of laboratories and workshops, away from the noise of bombings and strategic conferences, the weapon took shape. Each iteration refined its weight, its integration with clothing, its readiness for instant use. No celebration accompanied its creation, no rhetorical flourish described its purpose. It was, by design, invisible until needed, a final assertion of agency in a world that had stripped the agent of everything else, and in that invisibility lay its paradox. The weapon existed not to change events, but to preserve the possibility of choice. A silent line between being controlled and retaining the last measure of self-determination. The weapon that disappeared. The weapon, once fully developed, was a study in discretion. Unlike conventional armaments, it was not intended to be carried openly, to signal danger, or to intimidate. Its very design depended on invisibility, on the ability to exist within an operative's uniform without detection. The engineers who produced it measured every component with precision. The blade was short yet durable, capable of withstanding stress without bending or breaking. The handle was reduced to the minimum necessary to maintain control, contoured to the contours of a jacket or coat so that it could be drawn in seconds without revealing its presence. Integration with clothing was critical. Designers considered fabric thickness, seam lines, and the natural movement of the body. The knife had to be neither cumbersome nor conspicuous. Early tests involved agents simulating normal activity while the weapon was in place. Movements as mundane as reaching for a pocket or adjusting a collar were scrutinized for potential exposure. Even a slight metallic glint could compromise the tool. Attention to these details reflected a philosophy that valued subtlety over power, readiness over aggression, and discretion over spectacle. The weapon's small scale was deliberate. It weighed only a few ounces, enough to remain practical but not enough to disturb the balance of clothing or the operator's movements. Its sharpness was sufficient for immediate function, yet its purpose was not assassination in the theatrical sense. The tool was intended for last resort scenarios, a final option to preserve agency when capture made all other measures impossible. Every aspect, from metallurgy to concealment, was designed to maintain the quiet integrity of the operative's choice. Documentation from the period describes the tool in schematic detail, yet no accounts exist of its actual use. Operatives trained with it, yet no confirmed operation reports indicate deployment. It was a ghost within the system, an instrument whose existence was recorded but whose effect was never measured. Its disappearance from records may have been intentional, a measure to protect both operators and the system that supplied them. Files that detailed materials, dimensions, and training procedures were either destroyed or deliberately obscured, leaving only fragmentary evidence of its creation. In practical terms, the weapon exemplified a philosophy of minimal intervention. It did not create advantage but preserved possibility. The engineering decisions emphasized concealment over lethality, speed over force, and readiness over reliance. By reducing the tool to its functional essence, the designers ensured it would not attract attention before it was needed, yet it remained accessible when every other avenue had been closed. It was a quiet assertion of agency, a hidden boundary against complete control. The lapel knife did not exist to change outcomes. Its absence from operational reports, its invisibility in archives, and the silence surrounding its use reflect its intended function. It was a final option, engineered with care, tested in secrecy, and preserved in shadow. In a system designed to remove choice, it symbolized the last assertion of control an agent could exercise. The weapon that disappeared became, in that way, more than a tool. It was a reminder that even in the most controlled environment, the possibility of autonomy could persist. Training for seconds. Once the final option was integrated into an operative's uniform, the focus shifted to preparation for its use. Training was neither elaborate nor dramatic. There were no stage scenarios meant to simulate cinematic confrontations. Instead, instruction emphasized repetition, precision, and mental readiness. Every motion was measured, practiced, until it could be executed under extreme stress, with minimal thought and maximal efficiency. The objective was not to teach aggression, but to instill confidence in the ability to act if all other options were removed. Sessions often began with slow, deliberate movements. Agents practiced drawing the weapon, aligning the hand, and managing grip within fractions of a second. Each sequence was repeated until the body internalized it as instinct. Instructors timed each action, noting the difference between hesitancy and fluidity. Even minor errors were catalogued and corrected. The focus was on seconds because in a confined space, under observation, every moment counted. A pause could mean exposure, failure, or loss of agency. Training cultivated awareness of surroundings, the positions of observers, and the natural sway of clothing that might reveal a hidden tool. Psychology played an equal role in the process. Agents were taught to maintain composure under observation. The exercises were designed to produce stress comparable to detention conditions, rapid questioning, unexpected interruptions, and simulated confinement. These exercises did not aim to break the trainee but to condition the mind to function in the presence of constant scrutiny. Confidence in the tool's readiness reinforced a sense of autonomy. Even when physically constrained, the operative retained a measure of control, however abstract. Coordination of hand and arm movements was essential. Instructors emphasized angles, leverage, and body positioning. The weapon's short length required precision rather than strength. Training sessions included scenarios that mimicked restricted spaces, seated positions, or partial immobilization. The operative learned to draw and employ the tool without large movements, relying on subtle shifts and the economy of motion. Accuracy was more important than force. Every exercise reinforced the principle that the tool's effectiveness depended on preparation, not improvisation. Instruction also included contingency decision-making. Trainees were briefed on the conditions under which the final option should be considered. The emphasis was on judgment rather than impulsivity. Using the weapon carried consequences that could not be reversed. The training reinforced that its purpose was a last resort, and the decision to employ it required mental clarity under duress. Exercises incorporated simulated stress and time pressure to approximate the cognitive load of an operative facing captivity. At the conclusion of training, the operative was expected to integrate skill, timing, and awareness. Mastery was measured by repetition, the ability to maintain calm under observation, and the seamless execution of precise movements. The lapel knife became an extension of the hand, a tool whose readiness was guaranteed by preparation alone. In this way, training transformed the abstract concept of final choice into practical capability. The operative learned that even in a controlled and hostile environment, agency could be preserved through methodical preparation, discipline, and focus on seconds that defined outcomes. The record goes silent. After the war, investigators and historians pieced together fragments of information regarding agents, operations, and equipment, yet the final option remained largely undocumented. The lapel knife existed in training manuals, in schematic diagrams, and in the recollections of a few operatives who survived captivity. Beyond these traces, there were no verified accounts of its deployment. Files had been destroyed, deliberately or incidentally, and the people who might have described its use were often dead or unreachable. The absence of evidence was not merely an archival gap, it reflected the very nature of the system that had created the weapon. It had been designed for situations in which secrecy was absolute, where outcomes were uncertain, and where the act of using it could never be publicly acknowledged. Investigators found only indirect traces. Reports recorded that operatives had carried concealed tools, yet did not elaborate on their purpose or design. Some training logs noted repeated drills with small blades, emphasizing seconds and precision, but left no record of real-world application. The silence surrounding the weapon mirrored the philosophy behind its creation. It existed not to create narrative or spectacle, but to preserve the principle of agency in extreme conditions. Its success was measured in potential rather than action, in readiness rather than accomplishment. Histories of intelligence operations from the period rarely mention the final option. Accounts focus on extraction, communication, and sabotage. The weapon is almost always a footnote, an auxiliary detail overshadowed by broader strategic concerns. Yet its existence provides insight into the mindset of those who prepared operatives for capture. They anticipated environments in which conventional tools were neutralized, where psychological endurance was tested, and where the final assertion of choice could be the only remaining measure of control. It was a safeguard, an acknowledgement that systems of power could not completely eliminate human autonomy. The lapel knife's disappearance from operational records also illustrates the limits of documentation in wartime intelligence. Every use of force, every contingency plan carried risk. Confirmation of employment could compromise remaining operatives or reveal methods to the enemy. Consequently, maintaining secrecy was more important than recording outcomes. Engineers and trainers understood that silence was part of the design. In effect, the weapon achieved its intended function even without being used. Its presence reinforced discipline, awareness, and preparedness, quietly shaping the behavior and mindset of those who carried it. Ultimately, the record goes silent because the weapon existed at the intersection of human endurance, mechanical design, and operational secrecy. Its story is told through absence, through the careful calibration of seconds in training, through the invisible integration into clothing, and through the quiet acknowledgement that some possibilities are never realized. Designed to be unnoticed even by its carrier, it demanded discipline over impulse, readiness without intent, and mastery without display. It represents a final assertion of agency, preserved not in victories or feats of action, but in the mere capacity for choice within environments intended to eliminate it. In moments where identity, freedom, and control were systematically stripped away, the existence of such a tool offered a silent counterweight. The lapel knife stands as a testament to preparation, restraint, and the persistence of autonomy in the shadows of systems designed to erase it. Its silence is its legacy, leaving historians and operatives alike to measure its significance in potential rather than practice. Were you astonished by the ingenuity and secrecy behind the lapel knife used by SOE agents and the lengths taken to prepare for capture and interrogation? Share with us which detail surprised you the most.